Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted, as always, to speak to Canadian audiences in particular. My name is Alexander Motyl in Ukrainian, and I'm a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New Jersey on the Newark campus. And in addition to being that, being an academic, I've been writing novels as well as poetry for the last 10, 15 years. I've written 8 novels. This one, the one we'll be talking about today, VOVOCHKA, is my 8th. It came out just a few months ago. VOVOCHKA is written in the form of a memoir by Vladimir Putin's best friend and confidant, a man whose name is also Vladimir. They are buddies, extremely close buddies, and their careers begin in East Germany in the mid-1980s, where both of them are KGB agents. And then the book follows the trajectory of Putin's career. So it begins in the mid-1980s in East Germany, where he was a minor KGB agent, takes the story through the collapse of socialism in East Germany, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the period of the 1990s when Putin was a minor functionary in St. Petersburg and was eventually promoted to a position of authority in the Kremlin, and then takes the story into the period after 1999 when he was president into the 2000s, and roughly ends in the present time. His best friend and confidant follows his career. They remain very much in touch throughout. And then after 1999, when Putin becomes president, the two of them bring their heads together and plot to establish Russia's greatness, make it a great empire, and an authoritarian fascist state as well. As I said, the book is written in the form of a memoir. It's written in the first person. There is one section in the book, an entire chapter that purports to present letters written by Putin to his best friend during the period of the 1990s, which reveal Putin's own psychology and his own thinking during this critical period of his development. The book is satire, it's a parody, but at the same time it is quite serious, and it deals with 3 aspects of actual reality. One is the trajectory of Russia and the Soviet Union's decline, and then Russia's developments after 1991. It focuses on Putin's actual biography, so 2 things figure in the background. And then the third element, which is important, is that the book draws on and reproduces the language and the thinking of Soviet ideologists, KGB agents, and Russian nationalists and imperialists throughout this period. So if you read the book, it's supposed to sound authentic. This is the way these people really think and thought. To whom the book was intended for, it's intended for, in general, English language readers, people with an interest in contemporary Russia, people with an interest in Putin. It's obviously of some interest to Ukrainian readers, Ukrainian American, Ukrainian Canadian readers, inasmuch as these are all issues that relate to their own particular concerns as well. My hope, however, is that people will read the book as a work of literature, which is what it is. It is obviously a politically inspired book. It's somewhat of a political commentary, but it is, after all, a novel, and it should be appreciated or criticized as a novel first and foremost, and only secondarily for whatever its political pretensions may happen to be. Well, as you and perhaps some of your viewers know, I've been writing about Putin quite a lot in my academic and policy-oriented works. I've been doing this for the last 15 or so years, and my general view of Putin, at least within the last 3-4 years, has been that of a fairly incompetent statesman. I'm struck by his mistakes. I don't think he's a genius. I don't think he's an impressive leader. I happen to think that he is driving Russia to the grave, for better or for worse, but in any case, that he happens to be Russia's worst enemy. So in other words, my attitude towards Putin has always been very critical, and in recent years it's become even more critical. At the same time, in many of my blogs, as well as in some of my paintings, I paint, as you may know, I've taken to parodying Putin. I've written a number of exchanges between Putin and Santa Claus in my blogs. These were written over the last few years. I've made fun of Putin in a variety of my writings as well. And then in the middle of last year, I also did 2 paintings which satirized Putin, and the cover of the book happens to be one of the paintings. In any case, so a lot of this, in addition to the critique, there's been a lot of satire. And of course, the satire, the parody, has been assisted by Putin himself. On the one hand, he's an awful leader, a monster of sorts. He's also a parody of himself. I mean, if you've ever seen the way he projects his masculinity, his bare-chested appearances on horses, these are all, they're reminiscent of Saturday Night Live or Monty Python. It's the stuff of parody, and it's, of course, the stuff of self-parody as well. You may know that just recently he published a Putin calendar, where you can actually, every month of the year has a portrait, a picture of Putin smiling. I'm sure that there are Russians who think this is terrific, but for a Westerner such as us, this is funny. This is really very funny. So in some sense, the book was just a natural outgrowth of both the criticism and my own satire and his own increasing self-satirization. It just seemed like the obvious thing to do. Having criticized Putin in a serious fashion, why not take to criticizing Putin in a literary, well, also serious, of course, but in a literary and fictional fashion as well. Yeah, I'd like to think that this is a multidimensional portrait of VOVOCHKA, of Putin. It doesn't just present him as a fanatic, nor does it just present him as a bumbling idiot. As a matter of fact, it doesn't present him as a bumbling idiot. There's a whole series of levels here, and I realized this the first time I did a reading. This was a few months ago at the Ukrainian Museum in New York, and I presented the novel as a satire, and I encouraged people to laugh, and then I read a number of selections, and one of them was funny, kind of poking fun at Putin and his past, but the other 2 turned out to be deathly serious. And it occurred to me as I read that, even though I was obviously intending to poke fun at him, at the same time I had constructed a character, I think willfully and wittingly, not unwittingly, who was actually reflective of the real man. And in that sense, I think you get a sense in the book of his need for power, genuine commitment to the Soviet Union and Russia. Some of that's a little parody, but essentially it's really, I think it does reflect the way he thinks. I think you get a sense of his vulnerabilities. There are references here to his corruptibility. There are references in the book to weaknesses. So on the one hand, you have the image of the strong man, but the book suggests that on the other hand, there are also profound weaknesses and possibly even neuroses. And then, of course, throughout, there are jibes and jabs being made at him, so that there are certain parodic elements that are introduced. I think overall, the image of Putin is actually quite accurate. I do think he's probably sort of like this. And of course, we don't really know, right? No one knows. But I do think this is as accurate an image of Putin as you're likely to get. And again, as I said, with all due respect to the fact that there are some elements that are exaggerated in order to elicit a joke or a smile, right? But I think overall, this is probably the kind of Putin that Putin really is. There's talk about his family relationship, his relationship to his wife, his relationship to friends, his aspirations as a boy, all these sorts of things. I mean, so I think in the end, people will come away thinking this is a portrait that is very plausible. but at the same time very scary, precisely because it's probably very plausible. So you get an image of a man that isn't just as, it's not just a guy you see on TV. It's sort of an internal, sort of an inner portrait. And because it sounds plausible, I think people who read this will be laughing, but laughing very nervously, because it's, you know that you're dealing with something that isn't just a joke. On one hand, I do know how Soviets and Russian nationalists think and talk, so I think that helps. But more important for this kind of endeavor is, I think, having a fairly good familiarity with literature in general. I read a lot of novels. I read voraciously, and I've been doing so for many, many years. I read in English and Russian occasionally. I read a fair amount in Ukrainian, and I also read an enormous amount of German literature, whether Austrian or German, or by Austrian or German Jews, and so on. And I think through reading novels, you develop a fairly good idea, a good sense of human psychology. You also get a sense of what kind of how description, analysis, and especially dialogue or monologue can or should be constructed persuasively. Again, I haven't studied this, but I think one picks this up from reading writers, which is one reason why I like to read established good writers, because I know I'm getting the real thing. And that's in some ways the hardest part. I think you put your finger on the issue. I mean, how do you construct a persuasive character? Because it's easy to say, well, I mean, it's relatively easy to construct a multidimensional one, but how do you make the parts fit in such a way that the character actually seems to be a real individual who is thinking and talking the way real individuals think and talk, even if they're being parodied, even if there is satire taking place. The whole book can't just be one extended parody. It becomes boring after a couple of pages. There has to be that verisimilitude. And that's extremely hard. That's probably the biggest challenge of it all. Because constructing a plot, relatively simple. Describing the interior of a house, well, again, relatively easy, although obviously some writers do it with real finesse and others just do it in a boring fashion. But constructing these really persuasive psychological portraits, that's the challenge. And that's the most fun part, but it's also the most difficult part. Constructing dialogue that isn't wooden is very hard. You read a lot of novels, you get a sense that, you read a couple of lines of dialogue and you're thinking, no one talks this way, right? Yeah. No one talks this way. And, certainly this person shouldn't talk this way. No one talks this way. So how do you construct the dialogue that it really does sound as if it's being expressed by a living human being? One of the things that happens is, and when it does, then you're on the right track, is that as you're writing the dialogue, or as you're writing about a particular character, a particular situation, at some point the character comes alive and almost imposes his or her words, his or her dialogue on you, almost forces you. I mean, I've read, interviews or with by writers who say this happens. And when I first read this before I started writing myself, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But they're absolutely right. If you're doing a character well, at some point he comes alive, or she comes alive. And then the dialogue begins to write itself. And the plot almost begins to write or develop itself, because the person almost insists that you do certain things that are consistent with his or her character. And then the best thing to do is to just let that happen. You take that, you let the writer, you let the character just run with the ball, and then at some point you intervene or possibly deflect the conversation in a certain direction. But when that happens, in any case, it's the greatest feeling, and it's also, I think, evidence of the fact that you're on target. You're doing something right. much of the literature on the war, on Russia, happens to be serious. And of course, for understandable reasons, people are bemoaning the losses of lives, the destruction of the economy, the destruction of the country. So it's a little hard for writers, I think it's a little hard for writers to approach this in a jocular fashion. On the other hand, as you know, when it comes to Ukrainians themselves and their own popular creativity, there's been a lot of poking, of making fun of Putin. The popular song, Putin is, of course, fits very much in this stream. There's been a lot of satirizing him in artwork. He's been caricaturized in various forms. So in that sense, there has been a fair amount in Ukraine, but also, of course, in Russia, where people see him as somewhat of a ridiculous, pompous, bombastic, absurd dictator, who, of course, isn't just ridiculous, pompous, and absurd, but is also obviously extremely dangerous. My own sense, my own work is partly influenced by events going on in Ukraine, or at least by literary or other kinds of trends. I do follow those, but honestly, I suspect this fits more in the style of satire that you find in Mel Brooks, Charlie Chaplin, Woody Allen. These are films that I know rather more intimately and with which, of course, many of us have grown up and are familiar with very much. This book was really influenced by 30 years of reading Soviet and Russian propaganda. I do this for a living, essentially, and I wouldn't say these are my favorite authors or my favorite readers, but I'm so steeped in the way Soviet ideologists and Russian nationalists talk and think that it's almost second nature for me to replicate their terminology and their language. As to my favorite authors, there are a variety of them. I happen to be a great fan of mostly older authors, by the way. I'm not so much into contemporary authors. I prefer the older ones. And I love Edith Wharton. I enormously admire Graham Greene. Graham Greene significantly influenced my very first novel, Whiskey Priest, which came out back in 2007 or something like that. That was a kind of Graham Greene-esque novel. Then I like a variety of Austrian authors, German authors. I won't even mention their names, since I'm afraid many of them might not be all that familiar to North American audiences. Ultimately, writing novels is both an enormous challenge, much more challenging and in that sense much more interesting to me than writing nonfiction, which is frankly easy. Novels are very complicated and very difficult to write, but at the same time, they are deeply satisfying precisely because they're difficult and precisely because they're about language, plot, and character. So if you can get it right, and I'm not saying I did or have, but the point is if you can get it right, it's really a kick. Far more of a kick than anything I've done in the academic world, to be honest. And I've done some pretty good academic books, and again, I'm not being modest in that regard. So that's indispensable. If it weren't a kick, if it weren't a challenge, if it weren't fun, frankly, then of course I wouldn't be doing this. All the more so since I don't get paid for this, and the royalties are barely enough to cover a pizza and a beer. So essentially I'm doing this because it gives me pleasure. At the same time, when I choose topics, I tend to choose topics that, on the one hand, I know something about, and on the other hand, that are perhaps topical, that might have some interest to readers. If you look at the books that I've done, almost all of them reflect those two factors. So this was obviously topical. Putin was in the news. The Russo-Ukrainian war is taking place, is taking place. And it's to me that readers would be interested in a novel dealing with Putin. All the more so since, to my knowledge, there hasn't been anything like this So whether it's first or one of the first such efforts, it would certainly find some kind of niche. I've also, a novel I did 2 novels ago, I did something called Sweet Snow, which dealt with the Holodomor, and it was set in Ukraine, and it focused on that particular issue. The timing of the book happened to coincide more or less with the anniversary of the Holodomor. That wasn't so much intentional, but clearly the choice of the topic had something to do with my belief that it would appeal to readers. Another book I did several years ago was called The Jew Who Was Ukrainian, which dealt with a Jew who was Ukrainian, whose mother was a Nazi collaborator and whose father was a Stalinist collaborator. And it was an opportunity for me to explore the complexities of Ukrainian history and the relations between Jews and Ukrainians in the form of this hero of the story, and so on. Right? So one chooses things. I mean, one does the writing because it's pleasurable, and in that sense, almost necessary. But at the same time, the choice of topic happens often, not always, but happens to reflect something that's going on, perhaps. But not always, as I said. I mean, I also have a novel. My previous novel was called Fall River, and it dealt with my mother's family history. So it had nothing to do with contemporary issues per se, but was of some personal importance to me. I found I can write pretty much anywhere. In the past, I did an enormous amount of writing in Viennese cafes. I had an opportunity to visit Vienna fairly often, and cafes are really the best place to write. Nowadays, I don't so much write in cafes. I mean, New York cafes aren't amenable to writing. So I primarily write at home, not in my office. But in the past, I used to write in my office. I've written in other places where I happen to be. But in general, to be honest, I suppose, let me amend that a bit. Writing at home is probably the best place, at least now. I have my routine, and as any writer can tell you, the key to writing isn't so much inspiration and genius, it's to slog away at it every single day. And in my case, I tend to be a morning person, so I write in the morning, usually starting at 6 or 7 and ending by 10, 11, 12, depending on the degree of inspiration I have. But if I'm working on a project, I try to put in those 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day, every day, and possibly even on weekends. And then the juices flow best. And in that sense, since you're disciplined, you got to be disciplined. You kind of have to be in one place. If you're traveling, it's hard to write because things are constantly changing. There are 2 kinds of writers, right? There are some people who plan out every chapter, plan out the book, plan out every chapter, and pretty much plan out every paragraph in every chapter. And then they methodically write the perfect first sentence followed by the perfect second sentence followed by the perfect third sentence and so on. And then there's the other kind, and I belong in the second category. I believe in stream consciousness writing. I sit down for those 3 to 5 to 6 hours, and I just basically let my fingers and my imagination and the characters, I let them just run with the ball, regardless of where it happens to take me. Now, obviously, I have some general notion of what the plot is, and I have some general notion of what I'm going to say. But I let the spontaneity and the hunch and the contingency and all these other sorts of things, I let those dominate. So in the first instance, you're very much in control. In the second instance, you kind of hang out. I find that very creative. It leads to all sorts of fascinating, surprising, occasionally crazy, and sometimes awful things, right? But in any case, I find that extremely creative. But that second approach means that you then have to sit down after the text has been produced, 2 to 3 or whatever, how many pages, and then you have to go through that text and proofread and edit extremely carefully. I usually go through about 20 drafts, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, but it's usually about 20. So I just go over it over and over and over again until at some point I'm just bored, and then I usually know that's a signal that it's probably time to stop. And it's at that point, as you're doing the proofing and the editing, that frankly things, dictionaries and thesauruses can be very useful. You know, as you're reading the text, you find that you're using, some word too often. Well, you look for alternatives, you look for synonyms, there are all sorts of things that you can do like that. And then at that point, as I said, sometimes the synonym comes to mind, sometimes it doesn't, in which case you go into the dictionary, you go to the thesaurus, and you look for appropriate words that would convey the same meaning, but of course that are different, and therefore aren't, would make the prose a bit livelier and less. You write the book. You spend however much time, however much energy writing the book, and, why make it? It's yours. It is your product. It is your piece of work. It's there in the computer, of course, but it's also there on paper. Once the book comes out, that's it. You've lost all control over the product. And then at that point, the readers take over. Now, obviously, they may be interested in knowing what went into the writing of the book. They may be interested in knowing the author's interpretation, things of that sort. But ultimately, at that point, the text begins to live on its own. It is there. And at that point, the reader takes over. And readers see things. I've heard this in comments, during readings, people make remarks or they ask questions about something, and I realize, damn, that never occurred to me. But upon reflection, yes, it's actually there. They actually saw something that's there, even though it never had occurred to me while I was in the process of writing it. But that's understandable because, of course, so much of what we write, so much of what we produce, whether it's painting, sculpture, literature, for that matter, academic writing, is in some way spontaneous. We claim to be in control, but we're never fully in control. Same is true in painting, by the way. No painter plots out every single brush stroke. That's simply impossible. You paint, and then you realize that this particular brushstroke in this particular color in this particular place actually works extremely well, so you keep it. Another brushstroke might not, so you change it. Right? So there is a combination of spontaneity and control in everything that we do. Personally, I'm hoping that VOVOCHKA will very soon leave the historical stage, become history, and that there will be no more reason to write anything about him, whether of a political or political science or a literary nature, and that he will become exclusively a subject of interest for historians. That's my hope, and that's also my bet. I'm betting that within 2 years we won't see VOVOCHKA anymore. In any case, I'm certainly hoping that too. So I don't have any plans on Putin. I've done Putin. I did a number of paintings. I've satirized him in my blogs. At this point in time, I'm just waiting for his regime to collapse, and I'm waiting for him to, as it were, exit the historical stage and permit decent Russians to build up a democratic Russia, and for Ukrainians finally to build up a country without the threat of invasion by a fascist Russia. So that's my primary hope. As to your other questions, I do have a forthcoming novel. It'll be, it's somewhat satirical. It's called Ardor, A-R-D-O-R. And it is set, and it deals, and it's essentially a satire of intellectuals, policymakers, and academics. And it's set in northern Italy. And one of the minor characters in the novel is Yanukovych. He makes a cameo appearance for a number of chapters and then departs. But in any case, so that's my Yanukovych satire. Of course, Yanukovych, even more so than Putin, is very easy to satirize, since the man he looks like a fucking joke, right? But and that book was actually written before VOVOCHKA, but just due to all sorts of publishing and other kinds of priorities, VOVOCHKA came out first, so that's in the works and will probably come out sometime. Well, will certainly come out sometime this year. I'm not exactly sure when. And then sometime in the spring of this year, I'm actually having my first poetry collection that will appear with a small press based in Denver, Colorado, and it will be called Vanishing Points. And it consists of 90 poems written between now and, I believe, 2007 and today. So that's the immediate plan. That'll keep me busy for 2016. At this point, I'm still thinking about what to do next for my 9th novel. I have a number of things in mind, but nothing has quite gelled, and there hasn't been any lightning bolt of inspiration suddenly opened my eyes to the obvious thing that has to be done. So I'm letting that rest and gestate, and at some point I'm hoping something concrete will happen. It always does.